On this day in history, October 19th, 202 BC, as part of the Second Punic War, at the Battle of Zama, Roman legions under Scipio Africanus defeat Hannibal Barca, leader of the army defending Carthage. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. Battle of Zama, 202 BC. One of the most decisive battles in military history in its military result, Zama ranks above any, save perhaps Waterloo, for its decisive effect on the course of world history. For the defeat of Hannibal, the first and only true defeat in his career, left Carthage naked, and her surrender put an end to the long struggle between Rome and Carthage for the mastery of the Mediterranean world. The prologue to Zama had been the invasion of Africa by Scipio, almost in defiance of the Roman Senate, which wished him instead to attack Hannibal, who still stood unconquerable in southern Italy. In Africa, Scipio's brilliant series of victories over less formidable generals had forced Carthage to sue for peace before Hannibal could answer the summons of recall. But while the peace negotiations were being conducted in Rome, Hannibal landed at Leptis, whereupon the Carthaginians broke this truce, and Scipio's military position was gravely compromised. Isolated on hostile soil, and with part of his force detached to assist his ally Massinissa in securing his new kingdom of Numidia, instead of awaiting Hannibal near Carthage, Scipio cut himself off from his base and marched on a divergent path into the interior. Security lies often in calculated audacity, and as analysis of the military problems makes it highly probable that his march inland up the Baghrada's valley was aimed, by its menace to which the interior, on which Carthage depended for supplies, to force Hannibal to push west to meet him instead of north to Carthage. By this clever move he threatened the economic base at Carthage, and protected his own, also luring Hannibal away from his military base, Carthage. A complementary purpose was that this line of movement brought him progressively nearer to Numidia, shortening the distance which Massinissa would have to traverse with his expected reinforcement of strength. It had the intended effect, for the Carthaginians sent urgent appeals to Hannibal to advance towards Scipio and bring him to battle, and within a few days he marched west and arrived by forced marches at Zama. He then sent out scouts to discover the Roman camp and its dispositions for defense. It lay some miles farther west. Almost coincidentally, Massinissa arrived with 6,000 horse and 4,000 foot, and Scipio then broke up his camp and moved to a fresh site near the town of Narragara. His position being well chosen tactically, and having water within a javelin's throw, Hannibal also moved his camp forward to meet him. A parley between the two commanders led to no result, and both thereupon prepared to decide the issue by arms. The dispositions made by the rival leaders have several features of note. Scipio placed his heavy Roman foot, he had probably 2 legions, in the center. Laelius, with the Italian cavalry on the left wing, and on the right wing Massinissa, with the whole of the Numidians horse and foot. Heavy infantry were drawn up in the normal 3 lines. First, the hastati, then the princeps, and finally, the turiari. But instead of adopting the usual checker formation with the manipoles of the second line opposite to and covering the intervals between the manipoles of the first line, he ranged the manipoles forming the rear lines directly behind the respective manipoles of the first line, thus forming wide lanes between each 2 cohorts. The Carthaginian had 80 elephants, more than any previous battle, and in order to terrify the enemy he placed them in front of his line. Supporting them, in the first line, were the Ligurian and Gallic mercenaries, intermixed with Balearic and Moorish light troops. In the second line were the Carthaginian and African levies, their combined strength probably exceeding that of the first line. Finally, Hannibal's own troops from Italy formed the third line, held back more than 200 distance from the others, in order evidently to keep it as an intact reserve. On the wings Hannibal disposed his cavalry, the Numidian allies on the left, and the Carthaginian horse on the right. His total force was probably in excess of 50,000, perhaps 55,000. The Roman strength is less certain. But if we assume that each of Scipio's 2 legions was duplicated by an equal body of Italian allies, and add Massinissa's 10,000, the complete strength would be about 36,000. The battle opened, after preliminary skirmishing, with Hannibal's order to the drivers of the elephants to charge the Roman line. Scipio promptly countered by a blast of trumpets along the whole line. The strident clamor so startled and terrified the elephants that many of them at once turned back on their own troops. This was especially the case on the left wing, where they threw the Numidians, Hannibal's best cavalry wing, into disorder just as they were advancing to the attack. Massinissa seized this golden opportunity to launch a counterstroke, which inevitably threw the disorganized opponents. With Massinissa in hot pursuit, they were driven from the field, and so left the Carthaginian left wing exposed. The remainder of the elephants wrought much havoc among Scipio's velites, caught by their charge in front of the Roman line, but the foresight that had provided the lanes and laid down the method of withdrawal was justified by its results, for the elephants took the line of least resistance, penetrating into the lanes rather than facing the firm-knit ranks of the heavy infantry maniples. Once in these lanes, the velites, who had retired into the lateral passages between the lines, bombarded them with darts from both sides. Their reception was far too warm for them to linger when the door of escape was held wide open. While some of the elephants rushed right through harmlessly and out to the open in rear of the Roman army, others were driven back out of the lanes and fled towards the Carthaginian right wing. It was at this moment that Laelius, availing himself of the disturbance created by the elephants, charged the Carthaginian cavalry and forced them to a headlong fight. He pressed the pursuit closely, as likewise did Massinissa. Both Hannibal's flanks were thus stripped bare. In the meantime, the infantry of both armies had slowly advanced on each other, except that Hannibal kept his third line back. At first the Gauls and Ligurians had the balance of advantage through their personal skill in skirmishing and more rapid movement, but the Roman line remained unbroken, and the weight of their compact formation pushed the enemy back despite losses. Another factor told. For a while, the leading Romans were encouraged by the shouts from the rear lines coming on to back them up. Hannibal's second line, the Carthaginians, failed to support the Gauls, but hung back in order to keep their ranks firm. Forced steadily back and feeling they had been left in the lurch by their own side, the Gauls turned about and fled. When they tried to seek shelter in the second line, they were repulsed by the Carthaginians, who deemed it essential to avoid any disarray which might enable the Romans to penetrate their line. In a short time the relics of the first line had dispersed completely, or disappeared round the flanks of the second line. The latter, however, showed their fighting quality by thrusting back the Roman first line, the hastati. In this they were helped by a human obstacle, the ground encumbered with corpses and slippery with blood, which disordered the ranks of the attacking Romans. Even the princeps had begun to waver when they saw the first line driven back so decisively, but their officers rallied them, and led them forward in the nick of time to restore the situation. This reinforcement was decisive. Hemmed in, because the Roman formation produced a longer frontage and so overlapped their line, the Carthaginians were steadily cut to pieces. The survivors fled back on the relatively distant third line, but Hannibal continued his policy of refusing to allow the fugitives to mix with and disrupt an ordered line. The curtain now rose on what was practically a fresh battle. The Romans had penetrated to their real antagonists, men equal to them in the nature of their arms, in their experience of war, in the fame of their achievements. Livy's tribute is borne out by the fierceness and the long uncertain issue of the subsequent conflict, which refutes the suggestion that Hannibal's old guard was but a shadow of its former power. In the days of Trasimenus and Cannae, the Romans had the moral advantage of having routed two successive lines, as well as the cavalry and elephants, but they had now to face a compact and fresh body of probably 24,000 veterans, under the direct inspiration of Hannibal, and no man in history has shown a more dynamic personality in infusing his own determination in his troops. The Romans, too, had at last a numerical advantage, not large, however. The forces were nearly equal in numbers, according to Polybius, and in reality still less than it appeared. For while all Hannibal's third line were fresh, on Scipio's side only the Trarari had not been engaged, and these represented but half the strength of the hastati, or princeps. Further, The velites had been so badly mauled that they had to be relegated to the reserve, and the cavalry were off the field, engaged in the pursuit. Thus it is improbable that Scipio had at his disposal for this final blow more than 18,000 or 20,000 infantry, less the casualties these had already suffered. His next step is characteristic of the man, of his cool calculation, even in the heart of a battle crisis. He sounded the recall to his leading troops, and then, in face of an enemy at hardly more than a bow-shot distance, he not only reorganized his troops, but reconstructed his dispositions. His problem was this. Against the first two enemy lines, the Roman formation, shallower than the Carthaginian phalanx, and with intervals, had occupied a wider frontage, and so enabled him to overlap theirs. Now, against a body double the strength, his frontage was no longer, and perhaps less than, Hannibal's. His appreciation evidently took in this favor, and with it two others. First, that in order to concentrate his missile shock power for the final effort, it would be wise to make his line as solid as possible, and this could be done because there was no longer need for or advantage in retaining intervals between the maniples. Second, that as his cavalry would be returning any moment, there was no advantage in keeping the orthodox formation in depth and using the princeps and triarii as a direct support and reinforcement to his front line. The blow should be as concentrated as possible in time, and as wide as possible in striking force rather than a series of efforts. He therefore made his hastati close up to form a compact center without intervals. Similarly, he closed each half of his princeps and triarii outwards, and moved them forward to extend the flank on either wing. He now once more overlapped the hostile front. The role of Scipio's infantry in the final phase was to fix Hannibal's force ready for the decisive maneuver to be delivered by the cavalry. For this role, violence and wildness of onslaught was more important than sustenance. Scipio made his redistribution deliberately and unhurriedly. The longer he could delay the final tussle, the more time he gained for the return of his cavalry. It is not unlikely that Massinissa and Laelius pressed the pursuit rather too far, and so caused an unnecessary strain on the Roman infantry and on Scipio's plan. For Polybius tells us that when the rival infantries met, the contest was for long doubtful, the men falling where they stood out of determination, until Massinissa and Laelius arrived providentially at the proper moment. Their charge, in the enemy's rear, clinched the decision, and though most of Hannibal's men fought grimly to the end, they were cut down in their ranks. Of those who took the flight, few escaped. The completeness of the victory left no room for a strategic pursuit, but Scipio did not linger in developing the moral exploitation of his victory. An immediate move on Carthage achieved its object, a bloodless capitulation.